Hello, everybody. So yeah, this title has nothing to do with the talk. I just kind of come up with weird titles. But I am going to talk about interactive entertainment and the way it relates to linear entertainment and also just kind of general sociology and media evolution. Starting out with looking at the evolution of story, in media. Now, we kind of first had books, then we had live theater, went to radio, movies, then television. And a lot of people have been interpreting games through this lens, as though games really are kind of like the natural evolution of this. But in some sense, I think games have a very different evolutionary heritage to what I call linear storytelling media. Games really are rooted as far back, if not further, than the printed word, sports as well, then the idea of toys and play in general. Now, if we actually look at play, and kind of what it is, it obviously evolved for a reason. We see that animals play in the wild as a form of education. They're kind of playing out little scenarios that will help them survive into the future. We have babies. We look at our babies, and one of the first things they do is they start interacting with the real world. Their arms are flailing around. At some point they understand they can control this thing that's beating them in the face. They can pick up things, manipulate them. And that interactivity with the environment is their first natural kind of form of education. Storytelling is a little bit different. It's based upon these higher level functions that we have as humans: language, imagination, and empathy, the ability to kind of displace ourselves into another character in a story. And so these are all almost prerequisites for story. And story, in some sense, is a learned behavior. It's later that kids, once they learn language, start to enjoy storytelling from their parents. And there's a very strong kind of social bonding function that storytelling plays. Now, we see kids playing games, and we see them getting obsessed with them. And it seems like this continual kind of cultural concern that like kids are addicted to video games, and they're just so absorbed in these things. What am I going to do? I read a passage a while back, and it was interesting. It was a guy describing, he was walking into a room, and he saw a person sitting in the other side of the room absorbed in this device. And he was so fixated on this device that he didn't even notice this fellow walk into the room. And he could tell that it was like he wasn't even there. He had displaced himself to a different time and place, and it creeped him out. He thought he was possessed by the devil. What this was, it was from the 16th century, and it was the first time he had seen somebody reading a book. And so every form of media, in some sense, has had this ability to displace people and their imagination into some other place. And when we see our kids playing these games, we don't really think of it the same as reading, but in some sense, people get just as absorbed in books as they do in these games. Now, there's also this kind of cultural divide where, a lot of parents did not grow up playing games. Kids do, And a lot of the reasons why games seem cool to kids in some ways is that their parents don't do it, because we all kind of know the best way to make something kind of uncool is to, have your parents take it up and enjoy it. So, in some sense, the game industry has kind of thrived on that up to now. This is what people actually said about novels way back when they were first introduced. The free access to which many young people have to romances, novels, and plays has poisoned the mind and corrupted the morals of many a promising youth, and prevented others from improving their minds in useful knowledge. About the waltz. The indecent foreign dance called the waltz was introduced at the English court on Friday last. So long as this obscene display was confined to prostitutes and adulteresses, we did not think it deserving of notice. But now that it is enforced upon the respectable classes of society by the evil example of their superiors, we feel a duty to warn every parent against exposing his daughter to so fatal a contagion. And this is the waltz. Movies, of course. This new form of entertainment has gone far to blast maidenhood. Depraved adults with candies and pennies beguile children with the inevitable result. God alone knows how many are leading dissolute lives begun at the moving pictures. And then, of course, our favorite, rock and roll. The effect of rock and roll on young people is to turn them into devil worshippers, to stimulate self-expression through sex, to provoke lawlessness, impair nervous stability, and destroy the sanctity of marriage. It is an evil influence on the youth of our country. So every form of media, when it's first introduced, encounters a lot of cultural opposition, and games are kind of right in the midst of that right now with this generational divide between the people that kind of grew up with games and the people that didn't. In some sense, if we look at linear entertainment and how much time people spend across different age groups, it's probably a fairly flat curve in terms of, the average kid probably sees about as many movies as the average middle-aged person or the average elderly person. Nonlinear interactive media is very different in this regard, but over time it's kind of moving to the side, so it will flatten out over time. And we're starting to see that as parents are growing up, they grew up with games, and now they're actually playing games with their kids, and they have kind of a totally different perspective on what games are and what they can be. For most people, this is kind of their preconception of what games are, and they don't see a lot of social relevance, in them or value. But you look at other forms of media, we have trashy novels, We have, you know, action movies, and of course television is kind of known for the amount of violence that's on it. But yet, you know, and I have to admit, you know, at some point games do have this kind of over-the-top thing. Like some movies, you know, there's some very violent movies out there, but games seem determined to kind of outdo them in terms of, you know, and this is kind of unfortunate, you know, that games have this image to most people when in fact there are so many beneficial, interesting, socially relevant games out there, and we're starting to see more and more of those over time. But it is, kind of makes me ashamed that we aren't making more use of the medium. I'm not talking about censorship, you know, I think that I enjoy first-person shooters and all these games as well, but I think that we're very much underrepresenting games that are more culturally relevant to what, you know, versus where they could be. A lot of that's the thematic diversity of games. You know, right now most games are kind of either Dungeons and Dragons, sports, or military history, you know, and if you go to a bookstore and you look at all the different sections, you know, type of books you can buy, it's a much, much wider set of themes and subjects. And games, I think, will get here. They're just not there yet. It's going to take time, you know, and part of it's this generational thing. Until we have a lot of older people playing games, we're not going to have a lot of themes that appeal to older people. And so it's this kind of chicken and egg problem. Typically, if you go to a software store, you can look at most games and actually categorize them with a primary verb. What's the main thing you do in the game? And right now, you know, probably half the games, you know, the primary verb is kill. A few of them are race, manage. We have a few other lesser verbs. But over time, I think we're going to start seeing this equalize and broaden and diversify. Now, interactive design is actually a very interesting field, a very challenging field. I have a lot of people, you know, that play games, and they always come up to me and, oh, I'd love to be a game designer. I really enjoy games so much. I know I'd be a great game designer. And they're focusing very much on kind of the gaming part, and they don't give almost no thought to the designer part. And really, that's the hard part of game design, is the fact that as a game designer, you're trying to integrate all these different fields into one thing. Most of the game design documents I get look kind of like this in the mail. But at the same time, okay, you know, games are actually drawing from all these kind of previous forms of linear media. But at the same time, they're drawing from a lot of other interesting fields, things like architecture, toy design, product design, art, mathematics, behavioral psychology. All these things kind of collapse into the field of game design. I'm going to focus a little bit in this talk on the linear media side because of the BAFTA connection here. Now, in game design, we're still kind of back at this old, what I call apprenticeship level. Back several centuries ago, most professions like, you know, architecture and stuff were actually done through apprenticeship. What would happen is you would get an apprenticeship with a master. He would actually have you practice, you know, gardening or bricklaying or building or whatever it was for many, many years. And then when you were at the level of being a master, becoming a master, he would start teaching you the secret theories. And so theory was after you had actually practiced your craft for many years and experienced a huge amount of failure. It was kind of a failure-based learning. Around the turn of the 20th century, a lot of these professions got turned around through our educational system, where you would now go to school, spend several years learning the theory before you were allowed to actually practice. The idea was that the theory would prevent you from failing. It would protect you from failure because you were learning all the rules of thumb that people before you had learned. On the other hand, you were not directly experiencing failure or allowed to really innovate, you know, inside your craft as much as the apprentices were. So it's a very different kind of model that we've evolved for things. You know, game design really has no critical body of theory on the design side, so we're still very much in kind of the apprenticeship mode of it. A guy named Christopher Alexander has written quite a bit about this, where he talks about the apprenticeship is the kind of unself-conscious performing of the act, as opposed to the professional, which is very self-aware when it does design stuff. One is very much, you know, failure-based learning, and the other one is protecting you from failure through theory. There was an interesting story I heard about a pottery teacher, and he tried an experiment one class, and he divided his class into two equal halves. And he said, okay, this half of the class, I'm going to grade you at the end of the semester on one pot. I want you to make one wonderful, perfect pot, and your entire grade is based upon that one pot. The other half of the class he took aside and said, okay, I'm going to base your grade upon the number of pots you make. I don't care how trashy they are, just the more you make, the higher your grade. Of course, at the end of the semester, it turned out that all the best pots were made by the half of the class that was judged on quantity, because they had sat there and just made pot after pot after pot, and they got incredibly good at it. They didn't overthink it. They didn't sit there and, you know, theorize, you know, what the ultimate pot would be and spend the whole semester building it. They learned through failure, and they had a huge number of failed pots, but they actually ended up with a much higher quality product at the end. Games, in some sense, encompass from the player's point of view these three things in my mind. You know, they're really a combination in different amounts of story, hobby, and sport. From the story side, we get drama, discovery. From hobby, we get, you know, the creativity that people do in games, learning. And sport, competition and skill. we can almost make a space like this, and we can kind of look at different games and kind of say, games along this axis, basically story and hobby share imagination. There's a large component of imagination you bring to it. Not sports. In fact, you don't want to have creative interpretation over whether somebody made a first down or a goal or not. So you actually want to remove imagination from sports. Skill is really a function of hobby and sport, not so much story. And drama, story and sport. So these have kind of like tertiary dimensions as well, but you can take any game and kind of place it in this triangle and get some sense of what mixture it is of these different things, these different activities. Now, linear stories, in my mind, are very much based upon the idea of empathy. The idea that you can look at a character on screen, feel what they're feeling. They become an emotional surrogate for you as you're watching the movie. Interactive play is based upon the idea of agency, the idea that you are actually controlling the experience. Your hand is in there, you're manipulating it. As you manipulate it, it changes. In some sense, movies, one of the primary things about movies is that they're very visual as well as empathic. Games, of course, their primary thing is that they're interactive. And so in a game, when all of a sudden you're in a cutscene or something and you can't push a button or move the mouse, it's almost like being in a movie theater and all of a sudden making the screen go blank. You're throwing away the most valuable asset you have. And I think games are starting to realize this more and more, where you want to keep the player involved, keep them active, keep it totally interactive as much as possible, because that is the primary thing that games have to offer. That's why cutscenes in games I never really liked. But in some sense, both of these, stories and games are educational technologies, and they're a result of us being stuck in the time stream. We cannot rewind time, which is kind of a major limitation in a lot of ways, but we found ways around that. I think of play and story as educational technologies for dealing with this problem. What happens is when you have an experience, you can actually make a story about it or even build a game about it. And in doing so, you're abstracting something that happened to you. If you were a caveman and you go outside your cave and a tiger attacks you, you go back and you tell your friend, oh, be careful when you leave the cave, tigers are out there. That story, actually, the person can abstract to, okay, maybe when I walk out of the cave next time, a tiger might attack me, therefore I better look out. So we actually learn through abstracting stories into our own kind of personal situations. The same with games. We take abstract games, and we actually use these to build world models. We enhance the fidelity of our world models for predicting the future. These models are really just compressions of reality, of the data that we experience to predict the future and then alter our behavior. So really, it's model building that's at the essence of both story and play, in my mind. In games, we have a lot of learning cycles. So when you first pick up a controller, you're pressing the button, and the first few seconds you're trying to figure out what does the button do? Oh, it makes Mario hop. And then you've kind of completed the inner loop. At first you didn't know how to do anything. You got a little bit of success learning how to make Mario hop, and then you were allowed access to the next kind of cycle of interaction. And now you start moving Mario around and find out that, oh, mushrooms are bad if they hit me. And so every game is a set of nested kind of dynamics like this that the player's learning. And for each nested level, there's a success state and a failure state. For a game like The Sims, this is kind of how we graphed it. This is roughly at first, when you start playing The Sims, you don't know how to do anything, and you learn how to move the character and interact with things. Once you can do that basic control, then you get to the next level, which is the Sim has little needs you have to meet. And if you don't meet those needs, they pee on the carpet, or they collapse of exhaustion, or whatever. Once you can meet those needs, you move to the next level. And each one of these is a little bit longer time scale of interaction. But every game kind of has this set of nested interaction cycles. Games also have this unique property that we can always restart and replay. And this is getting back to the time issue. I can actually start a game at a particular point in time, play out a scenario, see how it plays out, go back to the exact start, try a different scenario, and explore a different potential future. This is something that we don't really get the chance to do in reality, which is what makes games quite unique in some sense for learning. We're actually exploring this possibility space. All the possible games that could unfold as we're playing the game are what we're exploring as a player. And every time we play, we're taking a different path through this possibility space. It's actually interesting when you look at players, how quickly in a game they can suss out the extent of that possibility space. In a few minutes, when I first played Grand Theft Auto, I got a sense that, wow, this is a really open-ended game. And it only took me a few minutes. And it's not because I'm a game designer. I think any 10-year-old could have played the game and at the same time figured out, how the range of freedom added up to a much wider range of experiences in this game. In some sense, it's like when you put a tiger in a cage and the first thing they do is they walk around the perimeter figuring out what's the extent of my environment. We've developed this instinct for complex systems to kind of interact with them for a short period of time and get a sense for how large is the landscape of possibilities in the system. Now I'll talk a little bit about storytelling structure, because I think a lot of people are trying to apply games overly to storytelling structure, but at the same time I see a lot of storytellers taking lessons from games back into storytelling, which I find very interesting and in some sense more productive. We're very used to the idea of, movies, linear stories, having this dramatic arc that the director or writer script out, the emotional arc, the viewer's going to go through. In some sense, at the basic level, what linear entertainment is about is this chain of causality. What is causing what? And it's this chain of causality that you're following in a story. There's a linear sequence where A causes B, causes C, causes D, etc. Now, at the beginning of Star Wars, you're kind of introduced to these characters, and we see the characters, and we see this kind of potential world that's set up. But at the outset, we really don't know where it's going to go, and we can imagine in our mind all these different directions that the story could take. So right off the bat, not knowing the story of Star Wars, I could imagine that Luke is going to become a giant land baron on Tatooine. That could be one possible story arc. Or Leia is going to pursue a career as an exotic dancer. Or Darth Vader is going to become an industrial designer that he always wanted to be. So these are all kind of latent possibilities that are embedded in the beginning of Star Wars, right? And it's only once the movie starts playing out that I actually get a sense of where the story is going. As the story progresses, I start refining my look into the future a little bit further. So every time the story kind of advances, I have a different set of potential futures that the story could unfold into. Now, part of what's happening as I'm watching the movie is I'm imagining all these potential branches that it could take, and that's what a lot of the drama comes from. In this scene from Indiana Jones when he's running out of the temple and all these traps are going off, in my mind I'm sitting there imagining, ooh, what if he fell down that? Or what if the ball squished him? And I'm actually playing out a lot of the possibilities that don't actually occur in the movie. But I realized that they were potential futures that the movie could have taken. And in some sense, what makes this dramatic is the fact that it has such a rich set of potential futures that are not, in fact, realized in the movie, and the fact that he avoids them so narrowly. So the imagination plays a huge role, I think, in filling out that possibility space as you're watching the movie, of the things that don't actually happen in the movie. One of my heroes, Alfred Hitchcock, used that to great effect in his movies. He once said that he could show you a scene of some guys sitting in a room talking for 5 minutes, and it would be the most boring scene in the world. But on the other hand, if he came on screen just ahead and said a bomb is going to go off in this room in 5 minutes, he could show you the exact same scene, and it would be thrilling. So in some sense, your imagination watching the exact same scene will totally shade the way you interpret that and how you feel about it. I'm really amazed looking at the old games, how abstract they were. The characters, this is one of my old favorite games, Choplifter, and they had these little tiny characters. This is one of the characters that you would rescue with your helicopter. It's one of the few games where you're like rescuing people. But it felt so good when you rescued these little guys and they got out and they waved at your helicopter and they were safe. And it was like, 12 white pixels waving at me. And I felt really good about it. These were like real characters to me. So the fact that I could kind of use my imagination to fill out these very primitive little, things is pretty amazing that the human imagination can be kind of manipulated in that way. Now, a lot of storytelling is about taking this chain of causality and amplifying the outcome, such that you're really escalating these branch points of what might happen at the outset. There's a leverage there. So at the end of Star Wars, basically that the Death Star is either going to blow up the planet where the Rebel base is, or it's going to be destroyed. And it all comes down to whether these photon torpedoes go down this little hole, right? And so this kind of seemingly trivial little event is causing this huge outcome in the rebellion. In some sense, this is really just an illustration of chaotic systems, which is something that we kind of tripped over in doing simulation work about 30 years ago. The idea that a very small change in your initial configuration can lead to a very different outcome. So if I put this ball on top of a bowl and drop it, it rolls off that way. If I move the ball over just a little bit, it ends up in a very different place. And this is called chaotic amplification or chaotic systems. And so a lot of movies really try to use this. This is a basic aspect of reality. And a lot of movies kind of lean on this, to the point where, something as trivial as the spilling of a glass will cause the secret agent to not see the villain, and he gets away and blows up the world or whatever. So movies, a lot of drama is based upon this chaotic amplification. Probably the most interesting thing about the difference between movies and interactive entertainment, and to me one of the most fundamental differences, is the fact that the director or the writer knows the future. They know exactly what's going to happen in this causal chain, which means because of that, and this is something we cannot know in a game if the player has free agency, they know what we need to see and what order in which we need to see it. And show us the relevant chain of events to follow the causal chain. Because if they know the future, they know what the relevant causal chain is. And without knowing the future, you don't. And that's why games and movies will always be very separate art forms in my mind. A lot of movies, on the other hand, have kind of played with different interpretations of this causal chain. I want to go through just a few right now. One of the fairly common techniques is you start a story with several different starting points, maybe different characters and totally different settings. And over time, they kind of go through their separate storylines, and they start converging. And basically at the end, you kind of get the sense that, okay, they're all going to converge. How do these things relate? How do these situations, at some point in the future, they're going to connect into the same causal chain? Magnolia is a good example of this type of storytelling structure. One of the more strange kind of experiments was this movie called Timecode. It was a very strange movie. It was actually, the screen was divided into 4 sections, and it was showing 4 separate scenes all the time through the entire movie. They were very disconnected scenes, but occasionally they would come together and they would merge into one scene. So on 2 screens, you would actually see the same scene filmed from different angles. It was all done in real time. It was very confusing to watch, actually, but it was a very interesting experiment. One of my favorite kind of types of movie is where they're kind of going down this path, and you think you see the potential future of where it's going, but all of a sudden it just takes a dramatic shift, left turn, someplace you never thought it would go. One of my favorite examples of this is The Matrix. When he takes the pill, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. Fight Club is another movie like that, where I had a totally different impression going into the theater of what I was about to see than what I actually saw. And I liked what I saw better than what I thought I was going to see. Memento is an interesting one. How many people here saw Memento? Oh, okay. Memento was very interesting structurally from my point of view, in that as the story progressed, every time basically it went a little bit further, you were actually seeing more of his memory and reinterpreting the past. So as the plot progressed, you went back and said, oh, okay, my assumption of what had happened in that first scene was incorrect. Instead, this is what really happened. As it progressed again, it was like, oh, nope, that was all wrong too. And so you were continually building new models about what you'd already seen. And so you were actually seeing the reverse of possibility space. You were kind of seeing past space reinterpreted over time. Groundhog Day, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, is one in which they took this to quite an extreme, where basically we kind of explored a path through the potential possibility space of the story. Then basically, the clock came on, 6 o'clock in the morning again, and we took a totally different path from the same starting position. And it was the most game-like movie I've ever seen, in that it was always the exact same starting position. And he was exploring infinity, basically. It was a movie about kind of infinity. But I thought it was just amazingly well done, because over time, they could skip so much of the previous scenes, and you would just fill it in as a blank. And so they could skip to, all the way to the end of the day. And they could cover so much ground that way, because you were filling out this possibility space very thoroughly as you watched the movie. Now, a lot of the way we interpret stories and stuff has to do with the medium, the format, and how it's delivered. Typically we used to go to a movie theater, sit down for 2 hours, watch a movie, or we'd sit and read a book, straight through. And all the way back, this is kind of a set period of time that we'd set aside for a story, and we'd sit through the whole story. Then television came around. And it was very different in that we could browse. It was browsable storytelling. When I was growing up, we only had 3 channels on our television set. And because of that, I ended up watching a lot of very bad television. And it's interesting, but also because of that, I ended up seeing a lot of very cool artistic things that I probably would not have chosen to see at that age. And so it was kind of a mixed bag, which is very different than today. Then we came out with cable, and we have all these choices, and then we had digital cable, and now it's to the point where I have to buy a robot to watch TV for me, because there are so many channels I can't begin to browse them. TV has ceased to be browsable in some sense, because there's so many channels. But one thing, almost like the way anybody can drop into a game and get some sense of how big that possibility space is in the first few minutes, we've also gotten very literate in storytelling to where we can drop in the middle of a plot, in the middle of a TV show, and very quickly kind of figure out who the main characters are, what's going on, which of the 12 basic plots it is, or whatever. So in fact, we have learned to browse these stories by just kind of dropping in and out of them at random times. And that's almost been a function of television. So we tend to think of this as very linear, but with the browsability, it isn't always. Games we tend to think of as very interactive, where the player can kind of get on their vehicle and go anywhere in the game, but they're not as browsable as storytelling is currently. It takes a lot more time to kind of get into a game, start it, install it, et cetera. I want to talk just a little bit toward the end here about media trends that I see. Most of us grew up kind of in this age of industrial mass production. We're used to designed artifacts that were, one design for many people, in product design, housing, et cetera. In media, it was kind of the same thing. We would go to a movie theater to see movies made by big movie companies. We had telephones, kind of delivered to us by AT&T or the, phone company. A few newspapers accessible to us at any given time. We had maps made by cartographers, et cetera. Now, basically, I have all these functions now in my pocket on my little phone here. Which is interesting. So all these functions have become ubiquitous in terms of media consumption. Not only that, but the computer is now becoming the hub of all this stuff. And because you can now create all these things, we have things, low friction delivery methods for all these things where anybody can make a little video, put it on YouTube, anybody else can watch it, anybody can kind of build, their Friendster page or, set up a news blog or annotate a Google map. So the whole model of production and consumption is moving around where now the consumers of these media are becoming the producers in some sense, or at least they have the opportunity to if they choose. When I first got my first computer, which was an Apple II, people back then used to think of computers as these elaborate calculators. But you ask kids now, what do they think of the computer as? And for them, it's basically a communications device. And that's a very different kind of mindset for what this thing is and how it's connected to, especially. Right now, we're in an age where all media is expected to be malleable. Anything you see, kids want to create games. They expect games to be as easy to create as movies or web pages or whatever. They want it to be malleable. And so we have so many people coming in, making this stuff now that we're, in some sense, back to the apprentice level of design, even with these older art forms that we used to think of as professional. So we have this kind of ladder, and this is, evolving across all forms of media, games, movies, books, et cetera, where there's basically a ramp where somebody can start as a consumer of, let's say, certain blogs, and at some point they can kind of work their way up. They can become an organizer of content, distributed content, or even a creator, make their own blog, make their own YouTube videos. And it's becoming a larger and larger part of our identity. When you think about, when you're describing yourself to somebody else, it's usually, this is where I live, this is where I work, these are the things I enjoy, my favorite brand of car. More and more, the websites you go to, the communities online that you're involved with become a very major component of how you self-identify. And also, in games especially, but on the web as well, we're starting to lean heavily, much more on metrics. We're able to measure things that you do, things that you enjoy, what you download, where you spend your time. And from those metrics in games, we're actually analyzing players and using that to do things like deliver content to the players. So the game experience itself can be customized to each person individually based upon the metrics of their behavior in the game. So in some sense, game designers are looking at the customers now, not so much as somebody that we deliver entertainment to, but almost more as an anthropologist would study a subject. We're actually looking at the things that they create and make to understand them, to find out what motivates them, and kind of, what environments, what tools can we give them that will make them enjoy these experiences even more. In some sense, the real thing that we're designing as game designers is in the player's imagination. That's the model that we're really building. So we give them a computer model, a game that they interact with. Over time, as they interact with that game, they're actually improving and refining their mental model of some aspect of the world or fantasy. And that's the real thing that we're actually trying to build over time. It's kind of important to realize that we're actually dealing with two processors here. We're dealing with the processor, in the CPU, which we're dealing with programming code. But we're more importantly dealing with the processor and the player's imagination. That's more about the psychology of the player. And sometimes we offload certain things to the imagination of the player. In The Sims, for instance, they don't really speak English. They speak this gibberish. But the players always fill in the dialogue very naturally. Had the computer actually put dialogue in there, it would have sounded very stilted and robotic. But having the player imagine it was a much more effective processor to run that part of the game on than the computer processor. So over time, really games and stories are both about building models, more effective models to understand the world, to kind of predict the future, and then to hopefully change our behavior for the better. Thank you.
Some of the music, some of the art, some of the beauty, some of the landscapes, some of the worlds that have been created in the minds of the people are gorgeous, fantastic, and wonderful. And the really, really neat thing about the game business is it really stretches the technological imagination as well as the artistic.